It began like any ordinary night, but ordinary nights have a way of unraveling into something unimaginable. Alone in his room, Lucas, a boy of just 13, felt a sense of solitude that was both comforting and unnerving. The kind of quiet that lets your mind wander into shadows best left undisturbed. It was the quiet of a house resting, its walls holding onto the stillness like a secret. But secrets, as Lucas was about to learn, don't stay buried forever. The radio sat on his nightstand, an old slightly battered device handed down from his grandfather. Lucas liked the familiarity of it, the faint hum when it was turned on, the crackle of static as he twisted the dial, searching for the perfect station. That night, he hadn't even bothered to turn it on. It wasn't plugged in, the cord coiled neatly beside it. He preferred the silence, or so he thought. But silence has a way of shifting, of turning into something else entirely. It started with a faint hum, so quiet it could have been mistaken for the wind outside. Then came the static, subtle at first, a barely there crackle that seemed to rise out of the stillness like a whisper. Lucas froze, his eyes darting toward the radio. It wasn't on. How could it be on? He leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat, as the static grew louder, transforming into a sound that made his skin crawl. A voice, distorted and faint, as though it were fighting its way through layers of static to be heard. The voice wasn't clear, but the rhythm was unmistakable, words, broken and fragmented, slipping in and out of the noise. And then suddenly, it wasn't noise at all. A familiar jingle played, one Lucas recognized immediately. Jovem Pan, a station he never listened to, was broadcasting through a radio that shouldn't have been able to play anything at all. He stared at the device, his heart pounding in his chest, the sound growing louder as if daring him to react. A coldness crept into the room, the kind of cold that doesn't come from an open window but from something far more unnatural. Lucas felt it then, a shift in the air, a presence that he couldn't see but could feel, heavy and oppressive. The voice returned, clearer this time, and Lucas swore he heard his name. A sharp metallic whisper that seemed to snake its way through the air, curling around him like an invisible thread pulling him toward the radio. His breathing quickened, panic setting in as he reached out instinctively to pull the plug, only to realize it wasn't even connected to the wall. And then it stopped. The room fell silent once more, the static disappearing as though it had never existed. The radio sat there, motionless, mocking him with its stillness. Lucas backed away, his legs trembling, unable to take his eyes off the device. He wanted to scream, to run, but the weight of his fear held him in place. He didn't know it yet, but that was only the beginning. What you're about to hear is a true story, one that will leave you questioning the boundaries of reality. If you're intrigued by tales that challenge logic and bring the darkness into the light, subscribe to Sinister Stories. Activate the bell icon so you never miss another chilling account. And remember, the scariest stories are often the ones that are real. Prepare yourself. Because this story doesn't end here. It's only just begun. Lucas's house wasn't the kind you'd call creepy. It was ordinary, a modest single-story home nestled in a quiet neighborhood. During the day, it was warm and welcoming, filled with the smell of his grandmother's cooking and the laughter of his siblings. But at night, when the sun disappeared and shadows crept into every corner, the house took on a different character. The familiar became strange, and the silence felt alive, like a watchful presence lurking just out of sight. Lucas's room was at the far end of the hallway, isolated from the rest of the house. It was his sanctuary, his space to dream and imagine. But tonight, the room felt oppressive, as though the walls were closing in. The faint glow of the streetlights outside filtered through the curtains, casting eerie patterns on the walls. Every flicker of light seemed to shift, as if the shadows had a life of their own. The radio sat on his nightstand, its once innocent presence now sinister. Lucas couldn't stop staring at it, his mind replaying the distorted voice he had heard earlier. The air felt heavier now, colder, as though the room had been plunged into an invisible fog. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just his imagination. But deep down, he knew better. Something was wrong. The layout of the house suddenly felt foreign, unfamiliar. The creaks of the wooden floorboards, sounds he had heard 1,000 times before, now seemed amplified, each one like a whisper of something moving just out of view. The old grandfather clock in the living room chimed, its hollow tone reverberating through the silence, marking the passage of time with an unsettling finality. Lucas looked around his room, his eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. His posters, once vibrant and comforting, now seemed faded and distorted in the dim light. The closet door stood slightly ajar, revealing an inky blackness that seemed to stretch endlessly beyond its frame. He thought he had closed it earlier. Had he forgotten? Or had it been opened by something else? Outside his window, the world seemed unnaturally still. The branches of the oak tree that usually swayed gently in the breeze were motionless, as if holding their breath. Even the crickets, constant companions of the night, were silent. Lucas felt the weight of the stillness pressing down on him, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. His gaze returned to the radio, now a symbol of dread. It sat there, quiet and unassuming, but its presence felt wrong, out of place, like an intruder hiding in plain sight. The shadows around it seemed darker, denser, as if they were gathering, conspiring. Lucas could feel his pulse quicken, a primal instinct warning him that he was no longer alone. The house, once his safe haven, now felt like a trap. Every creak, every flicker of light, every shift of the shadows fed the growing sense of unease. It was as if the house itself was watching, waiting. Lucas didn't know what was coming, but he could feel it. Something was there, hiding in the darkness, and it was getting closer. It began subtly, like a whisper just beyond the edge of hearing. Lucas sat on the edge of his bed, his eyes locked on the radio as though it were some kind of predator, poised to strike. The house had grown eerily silent, a silence so complete that it pressed against his ears. Then from that suffocating stillness, came the sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping, soft but deliberate. At first, Lucas thought it was coming from outside, perhaps a tree branch brushing against the window. But as he strained to listen, the sound grew sharper, more precise, and unmistakably close. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a branch. It was coming from within the room. His breath caught in his throat as the tapping morphed into something else, the unmistakable static crackle of the radio. He froze, his wide eyes darting toward the nightstand. The device remained where it had always been, its knobs untouched, its power cord still coiled neatly beside it. But the static grew louder, building in intensity until it felt like the very air around him was vibrating. The static shifted, breaking into a fragmented broadcast. Words sputtered and died in the air, as though something was struggling to speak through the interference. Then, a voice emerged, faint and distorted, but undeniably there. It wasn't the familiar, cheerful tone of a radio DJ or a news anchor. It was low, guttural, and wrong. The sound of his name sent a jolt through his body. The way it was spoken, drawn out and dripping with malice, felt like an icy hand wrapping around his spine. He wanted to scream, but his voice was trapped in his chest. Every instinct told him to run, but his legs refused to move. The room grew colder, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and numbs your senses. Lucas could see his breath now, a ghostly mist that hung in the air, dissolving into the shadows. And the shadows, he swore they were moving. Slowly, deliberately, they stretched across the walls, creeping toward him like ink spilling across paper. Suddenly, the radio fell silent. The abruptness of it was almost more terrifying than the noise itself. The stillness that followed was suffocating, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Lucas sat there, paralyzed, straining to hear anything, when the silence was shattered by a loud metallic clunk. The closet door. It had swung open on its own, revealing the black void within. But it wasn't just darkness anymore. There was something there, something watching. Lucas couldn't see it, but he could feel it, an oppressive presence that radiated malice. His heart pounded in his chest as the static returned, faint but insistent, like a warning. And then, the voice came again. This time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was clear, sharp, and laced with a chilling certainty. "Come closer, Lucas." His instincts screamed at him to flee, to get out of the room, out of the house, anywhere but there. But he couldn't move. The air around him felt thick, like he was submerged in an invisible current pulling him toward the radio, toward the shadows that now seemed to pulse with life. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms, trying to will himself to break free from the grip of fear. In that moment, a sudden sharp sound erupted from the radio, like a scream distorted by static, a sound that pierced the air and made his ears ring. The light bulb in his room flickered violently, casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls, and then it shattered, plunging the room into complete darkness. Lucas bolted from the room, his feet barely touching the ground as he fled into the hallway. But even as he ran, the sound of static followed him, echoing through the house like a sinister whisper, a reminder that whatever had taken over his room wasn't finished with him yet. Lucas stood frozen in the dim hallway, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The darkness behind him felt alive, an oppressive force that seemed to grow stronger the farther he moved from his room. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the static that now seemed to bleed into the silence of the house. He knew he should keep running, that whatever was in his room was something beyond comprehension, something dangerous. But a small irrational part of him, curiosity, defiance, or maybe fear of the unknown, whispered for him to turn back. The air in the hallway was cold, biting against his skin despite the heat of the summer night. He glanced toward the front door, the promise of safety just a few steps away. He could go to his grandmother's house on the same property, seek the comfort of her warm kitchen and soft voice. It would be so easy to leave, to abandon the room and the sinister force that seemed to linger there. But as he took a hesitant step forward, the static grew louder, more insistent, as if calling him back. Lucas. The distorted voice echoed through the house again, sending a shiver down his spine. But it wasn't just calling his name this time, it was daring him, mocking him. It was a taunt, a challenge, as if whatever was in the room wanted him to face it. His mind raced with possibilities. Was it a ghost? A demon? Or something worse, something without a name? He shook his head, trying to dispel the thoughts, but the voice was relentless. The faint glow of his room pulsed down the hallway, a bluish light that seemed to ripple like water. It wasn't natural, and it certainly wasn't comforting. Lucas gritted his teeth, his fear and curiosity warring within him. He had always been the type to ask questions, to push boundaries, but this was different. This wasn't just a mystery to solve, it was something primal, something that threatened his very sense of reality. He clenched his fists, trying to steady his trembling hands. He couldn't just leave it. If he ran now, the unknown would haunt him forever. He would never be able to sleep in that house again, never be able to sit in his room without feeling that oppressive presence watching from the shadows. No, he had to confront it. He had to see what was lurking in the darkness, even if it meant facing his worst fears. Slowly, cautiously, he turned back toward the room. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself were resisting him. The static grew louder, crackling like 1,000 tiny voices whispering all at once. The bluish glow from the room seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat, drawing him closer with an almost magnetic pull. When he reached the doorway, he hesitated. His hands trembled as he gripped the frame, peering into the room. The radio sat exactly where he had left it, its presence both ordinary and profoundly wrong. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker now, deeper, as if they were watching him, waiting for him to take the next step. Lucas. The voice came again, clear and undeniable. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a presence, filling the room and pressing against him like a physical weight. He took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage he could muster, and stepped inside. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the temperature plummeted. His breath formed visible clouds in the air, and the static seemed to surround him, enveloping him in a cocoon of sound. The radio's dials began to spin wildly on their own, flicking through frequencies with a frantic urgency. Lucas could feel his heart hammering in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins screaming at him to turn and run. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped closer. The static grew louder, more chaotic, and the voice that had taunted him began to take shape. It was no longer fragmented, it was speaking, a low guttural tone that sent chills down his spine. "You shouldn't have come back," it said, the words reverberating through the room like an echo from another world. Lucas's eyes darted to the closet, which still hung open, its dark interior seemingly endless. The glow from the radio pulsed brighter, casting eerie, flickering shadows on the walls. He realized then that whatever was in the room wasn't bound by the rules of his world. It was something ancient, something beyond his understanding, and it had been waiting for him. In that moment, Lucas faced a choice: retreat to the safety of the hallway, the warmth of his grandmother's house, or take one final step toward the unknown. His legs trembled, his breath quickened, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly alone. Alone with whatever waited for him in the suffocating darkness. Lucas stood in the center of his room, his body trembling as the temperature dropped further. His breath hung in the air like a spectral mist, and the walls seemed to pulse, as if alive, reacting to his presence. The radio on the nightstand was no longer just a harmless object, it was the epicenter of something dark and unfathomable. Its dial spun furiously, emitting bursts of static that seemed to form distorted whispers, voices layered atop one another, speaking in a language he didn't understand. The shadows in the corners of the room began to shift, moving unnaturally, as though they had substance and intent. Lucas's eyes darted to the closet, the black void within it now pulsating like a heartbeat, a rhythm that matched the pounding in his chest. The door creaked open wider, slow and deliberate, as if whatever was inside wanted to be seen. The voice returned, louder this time, clear enough to send a fresh wave of terror through him. "Lucas, why are you here?" It was no longer a whisper but a guttural mocking growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. His knees buckled, and he clutched the bedpost to steady himself, the fear so overwhelming it felt like his body might betray him entirely. Then, the shadows took form. From the corner nearest the closet, they coalesced into a vaguely humanoid figure, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally long and angular. Its face, if it could be called that, was featureless, a blank void where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. Yet Lucas could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, locking onto him. It tilted its head slowly, almost curiously, as if studying him, deciding what to do next. The radio crackled violently, a burst of static that made Lucas flinch. The voice from before returned, but now it wasn't alone. A chorus of whispers filled the room, overlapping, each one speaking in a tone of desperation, anger, or pain. Words like leave, trapped, and run intermingled with other phrases he couldn't decipher. It was as though countless voices were vying for his attention, all trying to tell their story at once. The figure stepped forward. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if it wasn't accustomed to the act of walking. The sound of its steps was hollow, a sharp clack against the wooden floor that echoed unnaturally in the small space. Lucas's instinct screamed at him to run, to escape this nightmare, but he couldn't move. It was as if the room itself was holding him in place, the oppressive weight of the supernatural pinning him to the ground. The figure stopped just a few feet from him, and for a moment, the entire room fell silent. The static ceased, the voices stopped, and even the pulsing glow from the radio dimmed. The silence was deafening, heavy with anticipation. Then, with an almost playful slowness, the figure raised one of its elongated arms and pointed toward the radio. The gesture was unmistakable, it wanted him to come closer. Lucas hesitated, his legs trembling, his palms slick with sweat. His mind raced with questions. What was this thing? Why was it in his room? And why did it seem so fixated on the radio? He thought about running, about bolting for the door and never looking back, but he knew in his heart it wouldn't let him leave. Not until he did what it wanted. Summoning every ounce of courage he could muster, Lucas took a shaky step toward the nightstand. The radio emitted a low hum, growing louder with each step he took, as if it were alive and reacting to his approach. The figure didn't move, but Lucas could feel its gaze boring into him, urging him forward. When he finally reached the nightstand, his hand hovered over the radio. The air around it felt wrong, thick and charged with an energy that made his skin crawl. As his fingers brushed the dial, the voices exploded into a cacophony of screams, a horrific symphony of anguish that filled the room. Lucas recoiled, clutching his ears, but the sound was inside his head, echoing in his very soul. Then, as abruptly as it began, the screaming stopped. The radio went silent, and the room was plunged into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no movement, just the oppressive weight of the void. Then, a single word cut through the silence, spoken in a voice that was calm, almost gentle, but dripping with malice. "Stay." The light from the radio flickered back on, dim and flickering, illuminating the figure for a brief instant before it dissolved into the shadows. Lucas stumbled backward, his heart racing, as the oppressive presence lifted slightly. But he knew this wasn't over. Whatever had visited him that night wasn't gone. It was waiting, watching, and it had left him with a message he couldn't ignore. The question wasn't if it would return, but when. The radio's dim glow flickered erratically, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the walls like living nightmares. Lucas staggered backward, his pulse hammering in his ears, as the voice returned, this time clearer, colder, and filled with a chilling certainty. "You wanted answers, Lucas. You found them." The words froze him in place, his fear giving way to a paralyzing sense of dread. The static returned, now layered with whispers that seemed to echo from deep within the walls. The room seemed to expand and contract as though breathing, and the shadows shifted again, forming shapes that twisted and writhed, their edges curling into jagged silhouettes. Lucas's gaze was drawn back to the radio, its glow intensifying as the dial spun uncontrollably. Suddenly, the static sharpened into a single, coherent frequency. A voice, not distorted, but disturbingly clear, emerged from the hum. It was his voice. "Why did you let it in?" the voice asked, matching his tone and cadence perfectly. Lucas's knees buckled as his mind reeled. How could this be? How could his own voice be speaking back to him, questioning him? He clenched his fists, forcing himself to focus, but the voice continued. You left the door open, it said, a sinister edge creeping into its tone. Lucas's blood ran cold. What door? He hadn't opened anything. But as the word sank in, his memory began to betray him. Flashes of the closet door, the subtle creak he had dismissed earlier, and the way the shadows had seemed to spill out like ink from its depths. The radio's glow grew blinding, filling the room with a pale, sickly light that seemed to seep into every corner. The air grew heavier, pressing against his chest, making it hard to breathe. And then he saw it, a figure in the light, emerging from the closet's darkness. Unlike the shadowy form before, this one was fully realized, its body unnaturally thin and stretched, its skin pale and translucent, like wax melting under heat. Its face was a grotesque mockery of human features, its eyes black voids that seemed to pull him in, its mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. It's always been here, the voice from the radio continued, now interwoven with the guttural whispers of the figure before him. Watching. Waiting. You invited it in the moment you touched the dial. Lucas staggered back, his mind racing for an explanation, a way out, but there was none. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, its limbs moving with a jerky, insect-like precision. The glow from the radio pulsed in time with its movements, the connection between them unmistakable. As the figure approached, Lucas's vision blurred, his surroundings dissolving into a swirling haze of light and shadow. Memories flashed before his eyes, not just his own, but others. Strangers, faces he didn't recognize, all frozen in moments of terror, their lives seemingly consumed by the same entity that now stood before him. It wasn't just haunting him, it had been feeding, growing stronger with each encounter. The figure stopped inches from him, its void-like eyes locking onto his. Lucas felt a wave of nausea as the world around him seemed to shift, the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurring. And then it spoke, not through the radio, but directly into his mind, its voice echoing like a scream trapped in a cavern. You belong to me now. A sharp pain shot through his chest, as if an invisible hand had reached inside and gripped his heart. The room dissolved entirely, replaced by a vast, endless void. He was weightless, suspended in nothingness, with only the figure's piercing gaze anchoring him. It raised a spindly hand, pointing toward the glowing radio, now floating in the void alongside him. The final revelation hit him with the force of a tidal wave. The radio wasn't just a device. It was a gateway, a conduit for something ancient and malevolent to reach into his world. It had been waiting for someone like him, curious, vulnerable, and willing to listen. Lucas let out a choked scream as the figure lunged forward, its elongated fingers reaching for his face. The glow from the radio intensified, enveloping him in blinding light. And then, darkness. When he opened his eyes, he was back in his room. The radio sat silently on the nightstand, its glow extinguished, its dial still. The shadows were gone, the air warm again, but the oppressive weight of what had happened lingered like a phantom. Lucas's chest heaved as he stumbled to the door, desperate to escape, but his hand froze on the knob. A faint, familiar hum began to emanate from behind him. He turned slowly, his blood turning to ice as the radio flickered back to life. The static returned, faint but growing louder, and the voice spoke one last time. It's not over, Lucas. You let me in. And with that, the light in the room dimmed, leaving Lucas standing in the doorway, trapped between the safety of the hallway and the darkness of the room that would haunt him forever. Lucas stumbled into the hallway, his legs trembling with every step. His room loomed behind him like a gaping maw, the faint hum of the radio now barely audible, as if it were calling him back. He slammed the door shut, his breath coming in shallow gasps. But the silence that followed was not comforting, it was suffocating. He pressed his back against the cold wall, his mind racing to process what had just happened. The air in the hallway felt heavy, as though the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The house itself seemed different now, its familiar walls and corners warped by what he had just witnessed. Shadows moved in ways they shouldn't, creeping along the floor and curling around the edges of the ceiling. Every creak of the wooden floor sounded deliberate, like footsteps that followed just a beat too late. Lucas felt as if the house had become alive, its very structure infected by the malevolent presence from his room. He decided to leave, he had to. His grandmother's house was just a few steps away, a beacon of safety on the same property. He pushed himself off the wall, forcing his trembling legs to move. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, the door to the living room seemingly farther with each step. He reached for the light switch, but it didn't respond. The darkness remained, thick and impenetrable, and the faint hum of the radio grew louder once again, even though the door to his room was shut. "Don't look back," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. But as he reached the threshold of the hallway, he couldn't help it. Something compelled him to turn, to face the room he had fled. His gaze locked on the closed door, and his breath caught in his throat. The light under the door flickered, a pale bluish glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. And then the door creaked. It moved slowly, agonizingly, swinging open to reveal the black void beyond. The radio's glow intensified, casting strange, undulating shadows into the hallway. From the darkness came a sound, a faint rhythmic tapping that sent chills down his spine. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. It was beckoning. Lucas turned and bolted, his bare feet pounding against the floor as he raced toward the front door. He could feel it behind him, the presence that had emerged from the radio, watching, waiting, toying with him. The air grew colder, and a faint whisper tickled his ears, a voice so close it could have been breathing on his neck. "You can't escape." He flung open the front door and sprinted across the yard, the warm night air a stark contrast to the icy cold he had just left behind. His grandmother's house was only a few steps away, but every step felt heavier, as though something unseen was dragging him back. He reached the porch, hammering on the door until it swung open. His grandmother stood there, her face a mask of concern. Lucas collapsed into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. He tried to explain, but the words stuck in his throat, incoherent and frantic. She held him tightly, whispering soothing words, but Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had invaded his room wasn't confined to that space. It had followed him. The night passed in a haze. Lucas stayed in his grandmother's living room, refusing to sleep, his eyes glued to the shadows that played across the walls. Every sound, every flicker of light, felt like a warning. He told himself he was safe now, but deep down, he knew the truth. The radio was just the beginning. By morning, the house felt normal again, warm, inviting, harmless. Lucas hesitated as he stood on the porch, staring at the small house he had once called home. His grandmother urged him to go inside, to prove to himself that everything was fine. But as he stepped closer, a chill ran down his spine. He could still hear it, faint and distant, the hum of the radio echoing through the walls. He turned to his grandmother, his voice trembling. "Can I stay here for a while?" She smiled and nodded, brushing it off as a child's overactive imagination. But Lucas wasn't a child anymore, not after that night. He had seen something, faced something, that had changed him forever. Weeks turned into months, and Lucas avoided his room completely. His family didn't understand his fear, dismissing it as a phase. But Lucas knew the truth. The radio was still there, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet and still, he swore he could hear it calling to him, whispering his name through the darkness. The house became a place of unease, a prison he couldn't escape. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, felt like a reminder that the presence hadn't left, it was simply biding its time. Lucas knew that one day, he would have to go back. The radio hadn't finished with him yet. The days that followed were heavy with a suffocating sense of unease, as if the very air around Lucas was tainted by what had happened. He avoided his house, spending most of his time at his grandmother's home, where the warmth of her kitchen and the constant hum of her television felt like a fragile shield against the dark memories that clung to him. But even there, he couldn't escape entirely. The shadows seemed longer, the nights colder, and silence no longer felt like a comfort, it felt like a threat. Lucas tried to explain what he had experienced to his family, but they dismissed his words as a vivid imagination or a childish prank gone too far. They laughed off his descriptions of the radio, the voice, and the figure that had emerged from the darkness. It was probably just a bad dream, his mother said, ruffling his hair with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But Lucas knew it wasn't a dream. The fear he had felt was too real, the cold too biting, the voice too vivid. The house itself had changed. Every time Lucas passed it on his way to school or to play in the yard, he felt its presence, watching, waiting. The windows seemed darker, like eyes peering out into the world, and the door to his room was always shut, as if it were keeping something locked inside. But he could feel it, even from a distance. The radio was still there, and it was still alive. At night, Lucas found himself plagued by vivid nightmares, dreams where he was back in his room, the radio glowing with that sickly bluish light. In these dreams, he would hear the voice again, calling his name, taunting him, daring him to return. The figure would emerge from the shadows, its blank, featureless face somehow conveying an unspeakable malice. He would wake up drenched in sweat, his grandmother rushing to his side to comfort him, but the nightmares never truly left him. They clung to him, like a shadow that followed him even in daylight. One night, unable to sleep, Lucas decided to confront the fear that had taken root in his life. He sat with his grandmother in the living room, the dim light of the television flickering across their faces. "Grandma," he said, his voice trembling, "do you believe in things we can't explain?" His grandmother paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Sometimes, things happen that don't make sense," she said cautiously. "But that doesn't mean they can hurt us if we don't let them." Lucas wanted to believe her, but he knew better. The radio wasn't just an object. It was a doorway, a conduit for something that didn't belong in his world. Weeks turned into months, but the sense of dread never left him. He refused to step foot back into his room, even as his family grew more frustrated with his reluctance. One afternoon, unable to bear their skepticism, he decided to show them. "Come with me," he said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at his resolve. "I'll prove it to you." His parents exchanged glances, but followed him back to the house. As they climbed the porch steps, Lucas felt the weight of the house pressing down on him, the oppressive energy radiating from within. He pushed open the door and led them down the hallway to his room. The door was closed, as always, but as he reached for the handle, he hesitated. His mother placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's just a room, Lucas," she said with a soft smile. But when he opened the door, the smile faded. The room was unnaturally cold, the air thick and stagnant. The radio sat on the nightstand, untouched but humming faintly, its dials slowly turning on their own. His mother's face paled, her hand flying to her mouth. His father stepped forward, reaching for the radio, but Lucas grabbed his arm. "Don't touch it," he warned, his voice trembling. "It's not just a radio." As if in response, the hum grew louder, filling the room with a low resonant vibration that seemed to seep into their bones. The shadows in the corners deepened, and the closet door creaked open just slightly. His parents froze, their disbelief replaced by palpable fear. Without another word, Lucas turned and fled, pulling them out of the room and slamming the door behind him. That night, Lucas and his family left the house, never to return. They moved into his grandmother's home, leaving their belongings behind. The house sat empty, but Lucas knew it wasn't truly abandoned. The radio was still there, waiting. Years later, Lucas would reflect on that night with a mix of fear and resignation. The experience had marked him in ways he couldn't explain. Even as he grew older, he avoided radios entirely, unable to hear the static without feeling the cold grip of dread. And sometimes, in the dead of night, he would wake up to the faint hum of static, even though no device was near. He knew then that he could never escape. Whatever had come through that radio hadn't just haunted his home, it had left a piece of itself inside him, a reminder that the veil between worlds is thinner than we think. And that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed.